Good evening and welcome. I'm Amna Navaz. Judy Woodruff is away. On the NewsHour tonight, in the dark. Russia targets Ukraine's power supply, causing widespread blackouts, but Ukrainian civilians remain defiant. Then, facing off. Candidates in high-profile contests spar over key issues on the debate stage, while others outright refuse to confront their opponents. And drying up. Utah's Great Salt Lake shrinks to unsustainable levels amid a decades-long mega drought.
This is the foundation of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, and we're seeing it crash and die right before our eyes.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular has been offering no-contract wireless plans designed to help people do more of what they like. Our U.S.-based customer service team can help find a plan that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Ukraine is sounding new alarms tonight about Russia's reign of destruction on its water and power supplies. Ukrainian President Zelensky says missile and drone strikes have knocked out nearly one-third of the country's power plants in just the last week. Today, strikes in the city of Zhytomyr blacked out all 250,000 residents for a time. We'll take a closer look at this after the news summary. In France, tens of thousands walked off their jobs today, striking for pay hikes to keep up with decades-high inflation. The work stoppages built on recent walkouts at oil refineries that have led to long lines at gas stations. Today, it's snowballed to include teachers, rail workers, and hospital employees. They said they have to have compensation for soaring prices.
Évolution, bien évidemment, du coût de la vie dans le pays tout à fait importante.
The increase of the cost of living is major. There's a rise in the price of basic goods, but also a very important increase in energy costs. All of this has had an impact on salaries.
Strikes have also swept other parts of Europe as the continent teeters toward recession. The ongoing protests led by women and girls in Iran spread today to a rock climber, Elnaz Rekabi, who did not wear a mandatory hijab while competing for her country. That was Sunday in South Korea. She left abruptly today. A statement on her Instagram page said not wearing the hijab was unintentional. Activists and independent reports say Rekabi was forced back to Iran and could be jailed. The protests were sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini after her arrest for dress code violations. A new report says Afghanistan's ruling Taliban tied up and executed 27 men last month in a hunt for resistance fighters. The open-source Afghan Witness Project verified a video showing Taliban fighters firing into one group of men for 20 seconds. The group calls the killings a, quote, orchestrated purge. The Taliban has claimed the men were killed in battle. Back in this country, the French cement company Lafarge pleaded guilty in New York to paying millions of dollars to the Islamic State terrorist group. The payments ensured that ISIS would let a Lafarge plant in Syria remain open. The company now faces nearly $780 million in U.S. penalties. President Biden vowed today that his top priority will be legalizing abortion nationwide if Democrats keep control of Congress. The president spoke in Washington 3 weeks before the midterm elections. He said everything depends on sending more Democrats to Washington.
If we do that, Here's the promise I make to you and the American people. The first bill that I will send to the Congress will be to codify Roe v. Wade. And when Congress passes it, I'll sign it in January, 50 years after Roe was first decided the law of the land.
For that to happen, Democrats would have to hold the House of Representatives and the Senate and abolish the filibuster, the 60-vote requirement for most bills to advance in the Senate. A federal jury in Virginia acquitted Igor Danchenko today of lying about his ties to a discredited dossier on then-candidate Donald Trump. He helped create much of the so-called Steele dossier. It included allegations that the 2016 Trump campaign colluded with Russia. A special counsel investigated the FBI's probe of those allegations. This was the third case resulting from that investigation. Amazon workers at a warehouse in upstate New York have overwhelmingly voted against unionizing. Today's announcement said 66% of the votes opposed joining a union composed of current and former Amazon employees. It is the fourth such election at an Amazon facility this year. Unions have won one and lost two. The other remains too close to call. And on Wall Street, stocks kept Monday's rally going as a number of companies reported solid profits for the third quarter. Major indices rose roughly 1%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 338 points to close at 30,523. The Nasdaq was up 96 points. The S&P 500 added 42. Still to come on the NewsHour, a look at key issues voters will see on their ballots in the upcoming election. What's causing the Great Salt Lake to dry up? A photographer documents immigration to the southern border and life inside a detention facility, plus much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Returning now to the war in Ukraine. As we reported, Ukraine's president said today that roughly 30% of Ukraine's power generation has been attacked and knocked offline by new Russian attacks. Nick Schifrin looks at a Ukraine partially in the dark as the cold descends almost 8 months into the war.
In southern Ukraine today, this is all that's left of a residential building. A giant crater where a home stood for decades. Destruction and death arrive from a clear blue sky. The price of Russian rockets that elude Ukraine's air defenses, this civilian's life as he slept. And the country's infrastructure. Today, Russia struck this combined heat and power plant in Dnipro. For the last month, Russia has targeted Ukraine's electricity grid, especially substations that serve as junction points between cities. Nearly all of Ukraine's substations have been damaged, and President Volodymyr Zelensky admitted today 30% of the country's power plants have been destroyed. That means in eastern cities like Kyivsharivka, where the destruction is still fresh, residents live without electricity or heat. 9-year-old Artem Panchenko helps his grandmother Irina prepare dinner. He eats in the dark, a family powerless to stop what's coming. They have to cook outside on the fire. Winter in eastern Ukraine is already arriving.
It's really cold. I'm sleeping in my clothes in my apartment.
I think it can be safely assumed that what Russia is trying to do is freeze Ukraine into submission.
Suriya Jayanti is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and co-founder of Ene, a U.S.-Ukrainian company focused on green energy transition. She says damaged infrastructure hurts Ukraine's civilians and military, and that Ukraine and Russia are playing cat and mouse. Ukraine fixes damage, Russia strikes it again.
So this seems to be a strike at the nervous system of Ukraine's resistance. This is going to be a very long, very cold, and very dark winter for Ukraine.
And yet Ukrainians remain resilient. In a new Gallup poll released today, 70% say Ukraine should continue fighting until it wins. And of those, 91% define victory as when all territory lost between 2014 and now is regained, including Crimea. But that could be more difficult now that Russia is using Iranian-made kamikaze drones that are 8 feet wide and carry about 100 pounds of explosives. Russia's already launched hundreds of drones. Ukraine has managed to shoot many of them down, but even a handful that get through can cause major damage and give Russia a new weapon of war. And to discuss further the impact of the infrastructure strikes and these Iranian drones now in Ukraine, we turn to Samuel Bendit, a Russia military analyst for the Center for Naval Analysis. Samuel Bendit, thank you very much. Welcome to the NewsHour. Over the course of this war, Russia has at times restrained itself from attacking infrastructure targets. But in the last few weeks, we have seen countless strikes across the country and now including using these kamikaze drones. Is this a shift in Russian tactics?
In a way, it is. It is a response to Ukrainian very successful counterattacks, Ukrainian successful advancements against the Russian forces in the east and the south of the country, and the Russian realization that it must do something to try and stem this advance and cause a certain level of attrition and essentially a certain level of pain on the Ukrainian defense industry, on the population, and the military.
And so why do you think Russia has turned to Iran, turned to these Iranian drones in this moment?
I mean, Russia has a certain capability that it was unable to really put in the field at scale. Iran was able to offer significant capability to the Russians in the form of loitering munitions like the Shahed 136 and Shahed 131, as well as several combat drones like the Mohajer 6. And these are relatively cheap and inexpensive drones by comparison to the damage that they can cause. So to Russia, this represents a very significant capability, an increase in their ability to strike Ukrainian targets.
And so the ability for Russia to now loiter above a target, as you're saying, these drones give Russia the ability to do, does that give Russia some kind of edge in this war strategically that you don't think it had before?
The drones that were used in recent strikes have a range of up to 200 kilometers. And so this represents a significant increase in Russian capabilities because now a bulk of the Ukrainian population, its military and industry are within range of these loitering munitions when launched either from the south, east of the country or even from Belarus.
Does Ukraine have the ability to defend itself against these kamikaze drones?
Absolutely it does. In fact, it has shut down most of these drones. More than 3/4 of them are actually lost in these attacks. The whole point of launching these munitions in waves is that a lot of them will be lost, but a few of them are going to make it past the air defenses. These drones basically saturate the air defense capabilities, and so one or two has to make it through to really cause the damage, and that's what we've seen in recent attacks.
And that brings us to those air defenses. Ukraine has been asking for more from the U.S., from Europe. The U.S. has provided some systems and is providing more advanced systems, as is Germany, as possibly other Western European countries are. Talk about how difficult, though, it is to create a layered system of defense that can really protect Ukraine, not only from these drones, but from larger Russian missiles as well.
It is a challenge. Specifically, these drones, the Shahed 136 and 131, they fly low, they fly slow, they have a relatively small radar signature, so they can't always be seen and identified by the early warning radars. They could be heard before they're seen because of their relatively cheap civilian-style motor. And so once the population actually sees the drone in the immediate vicinity, it's probably too late to do anything about that as it begins to descend to target. However, robust electronic warfare defenses are in fact capable of interfering with these drones' flight patterns. They use cheap GPS systems, or rather civilian GPS systems, that could be scrambled and jammed and interfered with. And this is where some of the successes against these drones has been visible lately.
Nearly all of Ukraine's substations, as well as the distribution lines for electricity, as well as for heat, have been destroyed. Those can be fixed in a matter of days, Ukrainian officials say. But Zelensky today admitted 30% of the power plants have also been destroyed. That takes a longer time to fix. Does that have not only civilian implications, but military implications as well?
Well, absolutely. Right now, Ukrainian civilian and military efforts are interlinked. A lot of the resources are part of the both civilian and the military effort. At the same time, this doesn't necessarily appear to stem the Ukrainian resolve in the face of these attacks. And it's not likely that these drones will have an effect on the Ukrainian population that Russia probably intends. But we're also in a relatively uncharted territory. If Russia continues to launch these strikes on a daily basis, and if Russia, in fact, gains more of these loitering drones, as the Ukrainian government itself has indicated, there's a possible plan for Russia to acquire over 2,000 of these UAVs. And if all of those are going to be used against Ukrainian civilian and military infrastructure, then this becomes a different type of war.
Ukraine's terrain gets very difficult to cross when it becomes muddy. That's in the next few weeks. But over the winter, will both sides continue to keep fighting and try and push the front line forward?
Both sides are preparing for winter warfare. Ukrainians are preparing for it. Russians are preparing for it. Russian volunteers are fundraising for thermal underwear and for warm clothes for their soldiers as well. So there's every bit of a resolve on both sides to fight into the winter to try and essentially for the Ukraine to push the Russians further south and east, and for the Russians to try and reverse some of the Ukrainian advances.
Samuel Bendet with the Center for Naval Analyses, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Great Salt Lake in Utah is the largest body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere without an outlet to the sea. An ongoing mega drought made worse by climate change means less precipitation, and a growing population is taking more water before the lake can refill. Scientists say the resulting record low water levels in recent years are worrying. Stephanie Tsai explored the lake both on and off the water to learn more.
Reaching the waters of the Great Salt Lake from almost any direction these days is a hike, and Brian Footen is carrying a heavy load. Founder of the Earthviews Conservation Society, he's equipped a kayak with cameras and sensors, mobile tools to map the receding shoreline.
This is going to log water quality data every 10 seconds, things like temperature, dissolved oxygen.
Satellite images capture the extent of the lake's shrinkage since 1985, but Footen says there's nothing like bringing the public right to its dwindling surface through his interactive website.
It doesn't take, charts and graphs and big scientific reports to tell this story, right? All you have to do is go out there and look.
And so we did, paddling through shallow waters with an astonishing vacancy of life. This northern arm of the lake is already forever changed by human decisions. The red tint is a result of extremely high salinity. It was choked off from the rest of the lake years ago to build a railroad causeway.
The Great Salt Lake is drying up. Climate change is responsible. Developers are responsible. And it just goes over top of people's heads, right?
Sure.
So what we're doing is using this imagery as a way to kind of go, wow, look at this. This is really happening.
Footen also sends the data he collects to biologist Bonnie Baxter.
The water is way out there now.
We meet her on the southern end of the Great Salt Lake. It is eerily quiet and smells of brine.
I feel like we're in the middle of just a dead zone here. It feels like another planet.
So it's like a dead coral reef. It's like a cemetery.
Yeah.
And these are the tombstones.
It feels like that.
Yeah.
If we see larvae in the water, or people casings, there's Sharpies to write on.
Baxter brings researchers from Westminster College to gather specimens weekly.
These mounds should be covered with mats of microorganisms that do photosynthesis and bring the sun's energy into the lake system. But you can see that they're dry and they're not green and they're out of the water. Even the ones in the water are not healthy because they're too salty. The ones out of the water are too dry.
The mounds are called microbialites.
This is the foundation of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, and we're seeing it crash and die right before our eyes.
The lake is at its lowest level in history. As a result, it's becoming too salty, even for species adapted to high salinity.
We're not finding any fly pupa today. That's terrifying.
Brine flies feed the millions of birds that flock here, as do brine shrimp, which are also harvested. It's just one part of the $1.3 billion economic output of the Great Salt Lake. To understand why the lake is drying up, you have to zoom out to the surrounding areas of the lake's namesake, Salt Lake City.
The state of Utah as a whole is the fastest growing state in the nation. Yellow is the new green.
Erin Mendenhall is the mayor, a Democrat.
Salt Lake City as the capital is seeing more growth in terms of units each year than almost anywhere else in the state.
There are more city residents than ever, but they're actually using less water.
We are absolutely committed to saving this lake with whatever we can. Last year, that was 2.6 billion gallons of water that Salt Lakers conserved. This year, it's already up to 2.9 billion gallons.
The city's achieved that not by mandating water restrictions, but by raising water rates about 15% a year and implementing a tiered rate structure.
So the more you consume, those water rates go up even faster. And these water rates reflect the urgency that we feel as Salt Lakers.
But beyond the capital, developments are springing up along the Wasatch Front. Single-family homes with lawns full of Kentucky bluegrass that demands daily watering.
It's ephedra, so something that's a native species.
In Salt Lake City, Jennifer and John Lair are part of a grassroots movement to swap bluegrass lawns for native plants that need less water.
Especially with the kind of exponential growth that the Wasatch Front has seen and expects to see for the next 25, 30 years, there just isn't going to be enough water.
It makes us wonder if we need to be thinking about living somewhere else. I mean, it's an idea we toss around, you know, how seriously, I don't know, kind of depends on the day. Of course, the question then becomes, where do you go from there? Where is not going to be impacted by climate change?
While conservation efforts by residents of Salt Lake City will definitely help, it may not be enough. 2/3 of the water in the Great Salt Lake watershed goes to agriculture, including the water from the Bear River.
It irrigates the farms and ranches whose yields Utah families have relied on since Mormon pioneers settled the region in the 1800s, fulfilling, they believed, a biblical prophecy to make the desert blossom.
I don't know what normal looks like anymore. It's been a long time since we've had good winters and good moisture.
Joel Ferry has a unique perspective. A fifth-generation Utah cattle rancher, he's also a former Republican state representative and now the director of the state's Department of Natural Resources.
Water in the state of Utah is a prior appropriation, so whoever used it first has the first right to use it today. And a lot of those rights belong to farmers.
Is it time for that to change?
Well, no, I mean, we have laws and we have structure. So what it's time for us to do is to implement more conservation measures.
Bipartisan support for conserving water for the Great Salt Lake led to a dozen laws enacted this year by the Republican-dominated state government. The reforms, among many provisions, do away with use or lose water policies.
We passed legislation that me as a farmer, I can say, you know what, I'm going to take my water, I'm going to put it in the river, and I'll receive a beneficial use, which totally changes the mindset of that use it or lose it. I might say, you know, wheat is not worth very much. I don't want it. I'm going to get some compensation if I leave it in the river.
One of the biggest worries is that the Great Salt Lake will go the way of others before it, not just drying up and ceasing to be a source of water, but becoming a source of poison.
Biologist Bonnie Baxter says more than 40% of the lake bed is no longer covered by water and could turn to dust.
We're likely to see an increase in dust storm as we expose more shorelines. We're likely to see more dust.
And that's toxic dust because
yes.
There is arsenic and heavy metal
exactly.
in this lake bed.
Right. So breathing these small particles, you know, has a huge impact on human health. But then you talk about the heavy metals and what that does to a system over time. And that's a little scary.
Other dried out salt lakes provide a cautionary tale. In the early 20th century, water from the Sierra Nevada mountains was diverted from Owens Lake to growing Los Angeles. By the 1920s, the lake was dry, and for decades after, toxic dust plumes sickened area residents. It is only one reason why for hours a day, Brian Footen paddles along the lake's shoreline, documenting its disappearance.
I think one of the big stories that's being missed in the talk about the climate and the drought and the agriculture and the development in Salt Lake is that this is a unique ecosystem on the planet. There's nothing else like it.
And that in itself, he says, is a reason for saving it. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai at the Great Salt Lake in Utah.
We are in the thick of midterm season, and with election night just a few weeks away, candidates are taking to the debate stage. But are these debates, in this political climate, mobilizing voters or changing minds? To dive into how all of this is playing out, I'm joined by two longtime political consultants. Republican strategist Brett O'Donnell. He's worked on debate preparation for 5 presidential candidates, including George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney. And Democratic strategist Stephanie Cutter. She served as advisor and deputy campaign manager for Barack Obama. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being with us. As you both know, a number of high-stakes debates just last night. I want to go through a few exchanges and get your analysis on each of those. First, in Ohio, we had the Senate candidates, Democrat Tim Ryan and the Republican candidate J.D. Vance, who debated last night on voters' top issue, which, as we all know, is the economy. Here's what each of them had to say.
And I really wish Tim Ryan had stood up to his party on this vote, because it might have made the inflation crisis we've been seeing over the last few months a lot better if he hadn't done what he always does, which is vote with Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden 100% of the time.
JD, you keep talking about Nancy Pelosi. If you want to run against Nancy Pelosi, move back to San Francisco and run against Nancy Pelosi. You're running against me. I put the natural gas provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. I was the one who made sure we had all of the investments in electric vehicles in the Inflation Reduction Act.
What about you, Brett? Is there something you notice in the way Vance is name-checking Pelosi and Biden? Is that part of the Republican strategy here?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, I think that while Tim Ryan tried to make the most, there isn't really a lot he can make out of it. The economy, particularly inflation, is running against Democrats. The Inflation Reduction Act, they've admitted, won't reduce inflation anytime soon, if at all. And so that becomes a problem for them. But, you know, back in 2014, Barack Obama said his policies were on the ballot. And in that midterm, Republicans won 9 Senate seats away from Democrats. And I think, you know, while we may not win that many, I do think that because of the economy and because the president's and Nancy Pelosi's policies are on the ballot, whether or not Tim Ryan wants to try and separate himself from them, he is their representative, and he's unfortunately going to have to bear the brunt of the blame for the bad economy.
Stephanie, what would you say to that? Do you see Democrats separating themselves from Biden and the economy the closer we get to Election Day?
Democrats knew going into this midterm that all of the historical wins were against them. Add to that the economy. So, you know, but what I do think that Democrats have been trying to do, and in some cases very successfully, is make this a choice between 2 different directions. And with the insertion of the Dobbs Supreme Court decision, you know, the ongoing insertion of Donald Trump in putting himself into this race, the raid on his Mar-a-Lago resort, all of those things have also you know, taken away the idea that this was a referendum on Democrats, and it's been much more of a choice.
Well, Stephanie, you mentioned the Dobbs decision there. I do want to ask you about abortion rights, because it has become an increasingly important issue for voters, a more central message for Democrats. In Georgia last night, in the gubernatorial debate between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, Kemp was asked specifically about a recording on which he was asked if he would go further in terms of restrictions than a 6-week ban he had previously signed. Here's what he said in response to that and what Abrams had to say on the issue.
Can you tell us right now whether you'd push for these measures or any other additional restrictions on abortion now that the 2019 law is in effect?
No, I would not.
He has weakened our privacy rights and women's rights. He has denied women the access to reproductive care. The most dangerous thing facing Georgia is 4 more years of Brian Kemp.
Brett, it's fair to say Republicans across the country have been rolling back abortion rights. Women on both sides of the aisle are concerned about this. Should Republicans be messaging about this more strongly, more proactively than they are?
Not only should Brian Kemp be answering his question, but Stacey Abrams should be answering the question, what abortion restrictions does she believe in? Most of the country doesn't believe in late-term abortions, yet that's the Democrat position. And so I think Republicans would do well to stay on offense, but also make sure that they address this within the boundaries of being compassionate, understanding that these are tough situations, and that they're going to handle them compassionately.
Stephanie, what would you say to that?
I would say that Republicans will have a hard time going on offense on this decision. And, I think women across the country, families across the country know that this isn't about late-term abortion. This is about whether women can make their own decisions with their doctors about what is right for them and their families. And, if Kemp attacked Stacey Abrams on where her restrictions were, the simple answer is this: women should make that decision, because having a false choice over late-term abortion, we all know that very, very few, far less than 1% of abortions happen after the 20-week mark. And that's usually because the baby will not survive or the mother's health is at risk. And who better to make that decision about what to do in those circumstances than the woman and her doctor.
I need to ask you both about another big issue that's come up again. It came up last night in the Utah debate, the Senate debate between Senator Mike Lee and independent candidate Evan McMullin. There is a backdrop to this. Obviously, Senator Mike Lee had early on encouraged then President Trump to challenge the 2020 election results after later reversing course. And all of this, we should mention, is unfolding against a very striking new poll that came out recently with registered voters from the New York Times and Siena College, asking people, is American democracy under threat? And 71% say yes, it is under threat. 21% say no. We should point out those numbers are virtually the same for Republicans and for Democrats. So, Stephanie, to you first, is that a message Democrats should be leaning into more?
I think that you do hear that on the campaign trail across the country. I think you hear it more in races like Mike Lee's, where he did encourage the president not to concede the election and participated in what ultimately became the January 6th insurrection. Now, Mike Lee didn't participate in that insurrection. That's not what I'm suggesting. But let's all be clear that, alleging fraud in an election where fraud doesn't exist, encouraging a president to not concede, to continue to say that he won. He still says that he won. All of that contributes to a lack of trust in our democratic institutions, a lack of trust in our democratic system, and lots of opportunity to overthrow it.
Brett, I'll let you respond to that. What would you say?
Sure. Well, first of all, if your number in the New York Times poll shows that there's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans who view democracy under threat. And it's not just because of what happened in 2020. There's lots of other reasons why people are worried about their democracy. They see the Democrats acting unilaterally. They see abuses of executive power. And so I agree that there are democracy threats all around us. One of them are hypocritic Democrats who want to say that democracy is under threat, but at the same time won't participate in what is the cornerstone of any good democracy. That is debate. And by the way, the threat to democracy is not the foremost issue on the minds of voters. Right now, a lot of folks out there are wondering how they put gas in their car or groceries on their table. They're worried about safety in their neighborhoods. They're worried about open borders. And so those are the things that are at the forefront of most voters this cycle.
Well, I thank both of you for setting the example today of how two smart people can show up and debate and disagree on the issues, but still be civil about it. My thanks to you both, Brett O'Donnell and Stephanie Cutter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For many voters this year, the focus has been on contests for governor, senator, or local representatives. But there is a lot more at stake in the midterms. Laura Barone-Lopez explains.
Voters in 36 states will decide on more than 120 statewide ballot measures this election. The future of abortion access, health care, and even voting itself is on the ballot. Reed Wilson is the founder and editor of Pluribus News, a digital news outlet that launched this month to cover public policy in the states. Reed, thanks for joining us. When abortion was on the ballot in Kansas, voters rejected a constitutional amendment that would have allowed for a ban on the procedure. Now there's 5 more states that have a ballot measure on abortion in November. Those include California, Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, and Vermont. What stands out about those measures to you?
Well, I'm watching 2 of those 5 states that you mentioned. They're very likely to pass in California and Vermont, but Michigan is a swing state, and I think Michigan is going to be instructive about what's coming down the line next year, the year after that, 5 years down the road. If putting an abortion measure on the ballot in Michigan drives turnout, especially for Democrats, I think you're going to see that come on the ballot in basically every state where the initiative process is a part of the political process. On the other hand, in Kentucky, like Kansas, a very conservative state, if an abortion ban were to fail, I think that would be a serious red flag for Republicans and those who oppose abortion rights as they go forward. This is really going to be a fight that takes place in the state legislatures, but I think we're going to see it on more and more ballots because both sides think they have an upper hand.
That's right. And the president today was saying that this could very well reach Congress by next year. So also over in South Dakota, there's Medicaid expansion on the ballot. Voters have previously approved Medicaid expansion in some 6 other states, but South Dakotans are going to decide whether about 45,000 people get this access. So what stands out to you in this measure?
This is one of the last fights over the legacy of the Affordable Care Act that President Obama signed. All of this, the Democratic-controlled states and even some purple states have expanded, even some red states have expanded Medicaid to cover those who make up to 138% of the federal poverty line. This is one of the last options that proponents of Medicaid expansion have to expand Medicaid through a ballot initiative. The vast majority of other states that allow ballot initiatives have either already acted on this or are so conservative that they probably won't.
And if that measure actually passes, then it'll also cover a number of Native Americans in the state who don't have healthcare access right now. I want to talk about ranked choice voting because that became really popular after the Alaska special election this year. And the big swing state considering that is Nevada, with several cities and counties across the country also. If it's adopted, what will it look like in Nevada versus other states?
So every state has a different version of ranked choice voting. In Nevada, it would be a top number of candidates who advance. It's not exactly everybody who shows up, but the top candidates who get votes in a primary, I think it's the top 4, would advance to a general election who are then decided by a ranked choice system. So you vote for the candidate you like the most. If that candidate comes in last, then your second choice vote gets reallocated as a first choice. They continue doing that ranking until somebody gets 50% plus 1. The theory is it is a way to bring more people into the electoral process, and it's a way for people to express their opinions beyond just the 2 major parties. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of opposition in Nevada from minority groups who think that it will hinder their ability to elect a candidate of their choice in minority-heavy districts. The supporters of ranked choice voting push back on that. They say that's not the case, but we'll see. So far, the experiments have taken place in Maine and Alaska, which are 2 pretty homogenous states.
I'm originally from California, and the top 2 vote getters that proceed on can sometimes become chaotic. Also, marijuana. This year, 5 states have it on the ballot. Those include Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And President Biden has talked about decriminalizing the drug. That's not the same as legalizing it, which allows clearly industries to build it up. Where do voters in these states fall on the issue of legalizing marijuana?
Well, this is a fascinating test because those 5 states that you mentioned, 4 are very conservative states. What we see here is this phenomenon of red states voting on marijuana legalization because supporters of marijuana have been so successful in all the other states where access to the ballot is available, where the ballot initiative is a part of the political process. So there are fewer and fewer states now where the public has the option to legalize marijuana. That means the next round of fights are going to take place in state legislatures, and it's not unheard of these days for a state legislature to approve legal marijuana. It's happened in Vermont, it happened in New York, in New Jersey. It could be going to red states next. It is not the third rail that legalized marijuana once was just a few years ago.
Across the 130 ballot measures, what's your big takeaway, and how could they impact voter turnout come November?
in a number of cases, including the Michigan abortion case that we talked about, these ballot measures may drive turnout to the polls. Who is likely to show up to vote in November? One of the things we saw after the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, striking down Roe v. Wade, is that the number of younger voters, especially younger women, signing up to vote ballooned. It jumped absolutely through the roof. So in a lot of these states, if we see those younger women turn out to vote, that'll be a sign that they are activated by these some of these initiatives.
All right. Well, Reed Wilson, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Several recent anti-Semitic comments from public figures, from former President Donald Trump to recording artist Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, have sparked concern once again about the rise of anti-Semitic rhetoric and the real-world consequences. John Yang has a conversation with the latest.
Over the weekend, former President Trump posted some disturbing comments to his social media app, Truth Social. They included this: "No president has done more for Israel than I have. U.S. Jews have to get their act together and appreciate what they have in Israel before it is too late." White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre denounced that post as anti-Semitic. It plays on the old trope that American Jews have a dual loyalty to Israel. Many also saw that last phrase, "before it is too late," as a threat. The post came just days after the musical artist Ye was suspended from Twitter and Instagram after saying Jewish people are trying to blackball him and tweeting that he would go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. Dov Waxman is director of the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and a professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. His most recent book is The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. Mr. Waxman, thanks so much for joining us. Are you concerned that comments like these from people like these, from a former president, from a megastar recording star, can spread anti-Semitic sentiments more widely?
Absolutely. I think the real danger here is that both President Trump's remarks and Kanye West's have the danger of kind of normalizing anti-Semitism, of legitimizing it. I mean, these are people who have a huge number of followers, particularly on social media. And when they're coming out and saying this, it kind of gives license to many other people to also express anti-Semitic statements. And it really signals a wider, I think, mainstreaming of anti-Semitism in our political discourse today. And that's really a worrying development.
You know, in the past, when former President Trump has been accused of using anti-Semitic rhetoric, he's defended himself by pointing to his daughter's family, who's Jewish, and to his support for Israel. What's your response to that?
Well, I think both of those things are really irrelevant to the question of whether he is or isn't an anti-Semite. I mean, as a side point, I don't think he is actually anti-Semitic, but he certainly traffics in anti-Semitic stereotypes. He repeats anti-Semitic ideas. He may himself not personally hate Jews, but I think we should also bear in mind that supporting Israel or having Jewish family members doesn't mean that one can't be anti-Semitic. There are anti-Semites who have support and who still support Israel, and there are anti-Semitic people who may have Jews in their family. So neither of those things, I think, disprove the claim that Trump is himself an anti-Semite. But I think the more important issue is not what he feels or the feelings he has towards Jews, but rather the way in which he repeats anti-Semitic stereotypes and encourages anti-Semitism among his followers and signaling to many of his supporters that those kinds of ideas are acceptable.
So much of this current discussion is about former President Trump and conservative voices. But of course, Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar has been criticized in the past for her comments saying that congressional support for Israel is based on money, not principle. Is this a problem, or do you see a problem on the Democratic side as well?
I think anti-Semitism is a concern on all sides of the political spectrum. Anti-Semitic ideas, stereotypes, ways of thinking can come up across the political spectrum, on left, right, or center. But I think we have to be clear that the great danger of anti-Semitism in the United States today, and the most deadly forms of anti-Semitism, are coming quite clearly from the right. So while statements about the power of the pro-Israel lobby or allusions to its control over Congress can certainly draw upon old anti-Semitic ideas, I don't think we should equate that with the kind of mainstreaming of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that is happening today within the Republican Party in the form of the kind of replacement theory or the demonization of George Soros, which happens on an almost daily basis.
There are times when criticisms and debate over Israeli policies, particularly Israeli treatment of the Palestinian people, can trigger accusations or denunciations of anti-Semitism. What's the line there? Where's the line?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and everybody, I think, draws the line in a different place. I mean, people recognize that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I think that principle is widely recognized. But where exactly criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism is much debated. In my view, criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic when it draws upon anti-Semitic stereotypes, anti-Semitic ideas or tropes or representations of Jews. In other words, when Israel is kind of depicted in the same ways that Jews were once depicted in anti-Semitic literature and anti-Semitic discourse, or when Israel is accused of kind of secretly engaging in conspiracies, where Israel is blamed for all sorts of world events, be it the 9/11 terrorist attack or the invasion of Iraq or even the COVID-19 pandemic. When you have that kind of conspiracy theory about Zionism and about Israel, that is also classically anti-Semitic.
I want to ask you about a tweet that my colleague Morgan Till spotted this morning. It's from Elon Musk. It's since been taken down. It shows Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Kanye West as the three musketeers. Kanye West with Parler, Trump with Truth Social, and of course Elon Musk says he's intent on buying Twitter. And Musk's caption is, "In retrospect, it was inevitable." Does this convergence on social media give you concern?
Yeah, I think really what we're seeing is the way as anti-Semitism really being trafficked on social media. It's not altogether clear that anti-Semitism is growing in terms of attitudes among the American public. What is happening, though, is that anti-Semitism is being expressed continually on constant basis on social media, and it's very often being amplified through the algorithms that social media uses. And so I think the real danger is in the ways in which social media now is spreading anti-Semitic ideas.
Are those ideas becoming more socially acceptable to say out loud, to express?
Yeah, I think that's the change. It's not necessarily that more people are subscribing to anti-Semitic ideas, but that the kind of taboo that may have existed to some extent in the past against expressing anti-Semitic ideas, that taboo is really ending. And I think, Kanye West's comments and Trump's comments and many other celebrities' comments about Jews have that effect of eroding this taboo against the expression of anti-Semitism and making anti-Semitism increasingly acceptable in mainstream public discourse. And that is a very alarming development, because from accepting anti-Semitism in speech and language, that can also ultimately lead to anti-Semitic acts and anti-Semitic violence.
Dov Waxman from UCLA, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There have been more than 2 million apprehensions at the U.S.-Mexico border in the last year. That's a record high. And since 2018, photographer Pablo Allison has documented the human stories behind these statistics. Laura Barón-López is back now with this conversation as part of our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
From the crowded tops of freight trains in Mexico to quiet moments of rest, Mexican-British photojournalist Pablo Allison has documented the journeys of migrants from Central America to the U.S. southern border for the last 5 years. His latest project, The Detainee Handbook, explores what it's like for migrants detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement from inside the detention center where he found himself in 2019.
How did you start photographing migrants making their way to the U.S.? I was driven to wanting to investigate the landscape of Mexico, traveling on trains from the southern border of Mexico up to New York. That was the intended journey. I couldn't avoid but to photograph the situation that I was surrounded by. That one journey ended up in about 4 years of on and off documentation of migrant caravans, individual journeys, following small groups of people migrating to the United States.
What are some of the forces that drive people to flee and make this difficult journey?
The first journey I did, I was in El Salvador, and I heard about the story of a kid was being recruited by the gang, and he didn't want to be a part of the MS-13 gang, and therefore he escaped his neighborhood. That was a vivid and direct account of what I'd been reading in news and books, specifically while I was working at Amnesty International, which is where I got to know more about the situation in Central America. My task was to find stories of human rights abuses and atrocities like the one of this kid. I've heard hundreds of stories of people that I've met along the route. The pattern is violence over poverty, although they go hand in hand.
What are some of the themes about humanity that you explore in your work?
I've found elements of love through meeting people that have a lot of love for themselves and the lives they live. Migrants is a concept that's used, like many other concepts, as categories to dehumanize. And so for me, I try not to use the migrant as a concept, but rather use names sometimes. Carlos, Pepe, Javier, Maria, Carmen, who are people that I've met along the way, and it's people that I've befriended. So those are key elements in the work that I do.
There's this photograph that struck me that I think gets at what you're talking about with love. It was in 2019 that you took it, and it shows this young Honduran couple, and it really evokes hope. Do you remember what that couple's aspirations were? What they and others with them were hoping to achieve as they traveled to another country?
It was early in the morning and the sun was rising. No one was awake. I took a picture and she spotted me and she looked at me. And then when they woke up, I remember telling them that they were a beautiful couple and that they were very lucky to be together, traveling and protecting one another. I don't remember asking them, but I just assumed that their aspiration was to seek for a better life, like everyone is trying to do from places where conflict and poverty exist.
And as you started this journey of photographing people who make this trek for a better life, you also said that you never considered visiting a U.S. immigration detention center as part of your photography work. But in 2019, you yourself were detained for several weeks after your U.S. visa expired. What was that experience like?
When I was going through immigration on the border between Mexico and the United States, I went through it and no questions asked, no stamp on my passport, because I had gone in with my previous entry and not with a new one, which I thought had been the case. It was an administrative error. I didn't know very well. They didn't explain. And I ended up being there for almost a month. It's a detention center, yes, but it smells, looks and tastes like a prison. Luckily, sadly, but luckily I was able to document this. Facing the terrible situation of being inside a detention center in the United States allowed me at least to be able to focus on that side of the story, which I never in my life would have thought I would have ended up doing.
And that side of the story is now the new book, the Detainee Handbook. It contains sketches, diary entries, and much more from your time there. So what was it like to document that experience without your camera?
It allowed me to stay calm for the time that I was there, which was almost a month. I focused on portraits of detainees, and I also asked many people in there to write their stories or ideas related to incarceration, migration, family, freedom, etc. So what you have in the book is a participation or a collaboration between people and my sketches of people.
Pablo Allison, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
Powerful conversation and some powerful pictures. That is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Amna Nawaz. You can join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you for joining us. We will see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
Actually, you don't need vision to do most things in life. Yes, I'm legally blind, and yes, I'm responsible for the user interface. Data visualization. If I can see it and understand it quickly, anyone can. It's exciting to be part of a team driving the technology forward. I think that's the most rewarding thing. People who know BDO.
Architect, beekeeper, mentor. A Raymond James financial advisor tailors advice to help you live your life. Life well planned.
Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. The Target Foundation, committed to advancing racial equity and creating the change required to shift systems and accelerate equitable economic opportunity. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.